thing that happened was that Deputy Carl Nolan, who was one of the group, asked a question in the Dáil at one stage. It was fairly far back now, about 18 months ago. He asked of Leo Varadkar as to what could be done for farmers whose farms are being sold by receivers without prior notice. And the Taoiseach, as he was at the time, said that actually that Deputy Nolan was wrong, that couldn't happen without a court order. Well, I heard that. I'm just astonished, really, that there could be such a level of just pure ignorance up in Dublin as to what was happening down the country. And even on a legal basis, that the Taoiseach of the day, that's Deputy Varadkar, was so poorly informed.
You're very welcome to the state we're in. Earlier this week, the Impaired Farm Credit Bill, drafted by the Master of the High Court, Mr. Edmund Honohan, was introduced in the Dáil by Deputy Mattie McGrath, leader of the Rural Independent Group, and it passed the first stage. I'm joined this morning by the Master of the High Court, Mr. Edmund Honohan, by Deputy Mattie McGrath, and by Brian O'Reilly, Right to Homes. You're very welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Kavanagh. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very glad to be with you.
Good morning, Anna. I'm delighted to be here.
If I could begin with you, Master, can you tell me a little bit about your role as Master of the High Court?
This is a very old status office in High Court proceedings. The Master was, if you like, a general go-getter and would organise things for the judges in the High Court. And the judges would ask him to set out conditions and timetables and so on and so forth. So basically, although it's described as a master, in fact, it's a servant of the High Court. So the interesting thing about the job is that you act as a filter and you begin to see patterns emerging in the litigation that's going through. And you can start drawing up your own data and figuring out what's happening out there in the real world. So that's quite useful to have, if you like, an overall view of trends in the law. And that's where I've developed, if you like, a detailed knowledge of issues that have arisen, particularly in relation to debt.
The Impaired Farm Credit Bill. So could you tell us a little bit about that bill and what it aims to do?
Yes, it was Deputy Fitzmaurice actually who bumped into him in Leinster House at one stage, and he asked me, could I do anything for the farmers? And of course, it's quite interesting when you think about it that farmers as a group are neither fish nor fowl, if I put it that way. They're not consumers and they're not businessmen. So the process for dealing with insolvencies, for debt and for debt restructuring and so forth for ordinary consumers is now well set out in the legislation. Companies Acts have their own mechanisms for liquidation, for administration and so forth. But a farmer falls into neither category. And so there's a gap in the middle there, which Deputy Fitzmaurice was quite right in identifying, because his constituents had experiencing difficulties in relation to the availability of credit for those entities, and also a particular difficulty in relation to the spouse of the farmer. He said these are two big issues that he comes across on a weekly basis. So it was at that stage that I began to think about what needed to be done. And Deputy McGrath was encouraging in relation to the possibility that a bill, if properly drawn up, could be introduced in the House by the rural deputies, the rural group, because obviously that's their main raison d'etre. And the next thing that happened was that Deputy Carl Nolan, who was one of the group, asked a question in the Dáil at one stage. It was fairly far back now, about 18 months ago. He asked of Leo Varadkar as to what could be done for farmers whose farms are being sold by receivers without prior notice. And the Taoiseach, as he was at the time, said that actually that Deputy Nolan was wrong, that couldn't happen without a court order. Well, I heard that. I'm just astonished, really, that there could be such a level of just pure ignorance up in Dublin as to what was happening down the country. And even on a legal basis, that the Taoiseach of the day, that's the Deputy Varadkar, was so poorly informed. And he brushed Carol Nolan's queries aside and said that Carol was just didn't understand the legal system. Where actually it was the other way around. So I got stuck into it then at that stage. I decided that there needed to be two different elements to the bill. And one was to deal with in opportunity to be given to the farmer who got into debt to work through that debt by means of a monitored program. And as a luck would have it, the UK Parliament had introduced legislation similar to that in relation to small businesses. And it was very easy to simply cut and paste material from that legislation, which would allow for, if you like, a diminished role for the receiver, a role in which the receiver would sit back and not take possession of the lands, even though there was a debt. And then there was a process by which the time allowed for a farmer to reorganize his business would be extended. That was one element of it. And then the other element of it was to recognize the fact that there was a serious problem in relation to the farmstead, family home on the farm, if the family home had been offered as a security. And that was being overlooked by the process of a sale by receiver. And it seemed to me that it was necessary to take a knife to the security and divide it into two. That's to say that the security would become in part on the lands and in part on the house, and then to deal with each part or parcel in a different way, and to give to the spouse who wasn't the farmer the right to be protected under the family home protections and under the mark process, and all of which applies to ordinary family homes in Dublin and elsewhere. And that was additional protection which enabled, if you like, the court in an appropriate case to allow the farm itself, the farmhouse itself, to be preserved for the family, even though the farmlands might well have to be sold in due course. So there was an additional element of security there for farmers as family people. That was also quite important. And finally, then I looked at the question of why was it that farmers were actually getting into problems with debt, and it's quite important to realise that the availability of credit is very tenuous in farming, and there's a reason for that, and that is because the price for farm produce is totally unpredictable. You go into the bank and you say, "I'm hoping to make so much next year. had a good year last year. I'm hoping to improve on it." And the bank manager, if you even get to see him, will say, "Well, it's all very tenuous, isn't it? We're not quite sure what's going to be coming down the road. We can't extend your credit." So this is a complete mismatch between the bank's business model and the farmer's business model. And throughout, when I started looking into it, I discovered that this was in fact a constant theme throughout Dáil debates from the time of Hogan's Land Acts, 1923, under the Banking Commission and so forth. And I thought, all of this is a very live issue down the country, and yet has been completely overlooked here in Dublin. So there was a need to address that as well and see whether or not new models could be generated, which would enable the farmer to have access to credit on much fairer basis, and on the basis of, if you like, almost a joint venture basis with the credit facilitators. Just as, funny enough, preparing for this morning's interview, I know I'm going on a bit now, but there you are. I came in with yesterday's Irish Times. It says, and the heading is, "Global investors are flocking to Ireland." Well, that's exactly the point. There's now huge amounts of capital out there in the capital market, which is now a worldwide market. And at the moment, the farmers are simply reduced to trotting up the road to the local bank or to the local credit union and trying to do it in a traditional way, when in fact, the global capital market has now a range of issues, a range of mechanisms available to us to deal with particular risk models that apply. Just as an example of that, There's there you are. I have that on that. Here it is. It says Linked Finance launches solution for SMEs to borrow against card sales. And if you look at that, it says Linked Finance. It says will allow businesses to borrow a lump sum and then repay it gradually through a percentage of their daily card receipts. When you say, well, yeah, so that makes an awful lot of sense. But there's no imagination being used in relation to farm credit. If you got some of the big accountancy firms in Dublin to sit down and say, let's work out a new model for farm credit, they would come up with something imaginative like this. And they would tap into the world capital market, and capital would be available. And it's absolutely essential that there should be capital available for agriculture at this stage, given the climate change programme and all the other changes that we're experiencing.
Deputy McGrath, you are, of course, on the front line meeting with farmers that have got into financial difficulties. And would it be true to say that this generated your interest in pushing for an impaired farm credit bill?
Indeed, yes, I meet them on a regular basis, whether I meet them at Marts or meet them at Mass or meet them out on the roads, my clinics, but many are coming to the privacy of my clinics to sit down and, sometimes the spouse may come, they're shocked, worried, maybe in some cases didn't even know that they were, liable and there was a party to this. And I remember myself put my hands up, signing hire purchase loans as a contractor on the wheel of a tractor because you were busy out in the spring or wherever you were enthusiastic, you bought a new machine, whatever it be, and he drove into the field, the finance man, and you signed it up. And you didn't even look at the pages, not to mind small print. So we're deeply indebted to the Master of the High Court, it was Edmund Honan, for running with this. And I want to acknowledge the help of my Justice Morris, John McGuinness, indeed Senator David Norris, and my own colleagues in the Rural Independent Group, Brian O'Reilly, and yourself, and many others. So look, it's an excellent piece of legislation. I introduced it on Tuesday. The government didn't oppose it, which is great. Introduction of the Impaired Farm Credit Bill 2022. This innovative bill aims to protect the family farm from vulture funds and provide for availability of low-interest credit to Irish family farmers who have been far too long despicably treated by our pillar banks. The bill is sponsored by my Rural Independent colleagues, some who are here with me, and it has been carefully drafted on our behalf by the Master of the High Court, Edmund Honan, and I really couldn't thank him enough for that. For too long, the government here have facilitated vulture funds and banks to seize and sell family farms in Ireland. The bill would create a policy platform to tip the scales back in favour of the landowners and farmers, and is all about protecting the small man or woman against predatory financial institutions. I give the commitment that we'll use our private members' time, which we only get once every 6 weeks, if the government don't intend to move this, and I imagine it'll fall back on us to introduce it at second stage and try and progress it along. It then, of course, goes to the drafters and goes into the bowels of, say, government machinations and how they and the Department of Finance and all that. So that's where we really look forward to holding on to Edmund and his valuable expertise, because we may end up, as we did yesterday with this legislation regarding the whole judiciary, that I described as useless, toothless and fruitless, because this is what happens. They set out on a roadmap and you deviate down so many different roads that it doesn't have the desired effect. It needs to be watertight. It needs to have the desired effect. I was interested from Med, especially to tell us that models like this are in America for nearly half a century or more. They're in England. And why are we the Wild West when it comes to farming? Farming is so important here, and families are so important to our economy, because if the family units and they fail, small farmers fail, we can all be conglomerates. Then our villages, our rural towns, the whole lot's in trouble. And there's a big risk to the food supply as well and the food chain. So we look forward very much to trying progressing this piece of legislation, so badly needed. It's so obvious that it's kind of blatant, but, the vulture funds and the bankers have gone away with blue murder here. And actual fact, and I mentioned that yesterday as well, in my debate on the other piece of legislation, we were introducing COVID laws in the last 2 years, and we stuck in a very serious piece of information in relation to hearsay legislation into COVID situation, COVID bill dealing with COVID is totally unacceptable. But you see what the government and the system and the power base will do when they have an opportunity. So I'm not under no illusions, and we're under no illusion as to difficulty, but it's so badly needed, because it's a shocking situation when I find out when a farmer rings me, rings another one of my TDs and says, I got a phone call last night from my neighbour at 1 o'clock. I thought something was up. No, I said, and he couldn't get me on the phone. He came down to the front door, banging on the door. Do you realise your farm is up for auction tonight on some internet or some online sales? And the farmer completely unaware of that. So the separation here of the house, the family homestead, from the land is vital, and also protection for the spouse or the partner or whoever else is in the family as well is so vital. So it's a job of work, and we're up for it, but we need the support of all other independent groups and indeed opposition group at the moment, and a willing government as well. So look, we'll see what happens.
And it's good to see Ed and Matty after the successful launch of, I have a copy of it here, the bill, which went through the first phase, as you've just been discussing, successfully. So it's a step in the right direction, but of course, only part of a much bigger story.
What I want to talk to you about this morning, Brian, is right to homes and the bill that was drafted by Mr. Honohan and what became of it. So I know it's a very long story, Brian, but as briefly as possible, can you tell us a little bit about the right to homes bill and then what became of it?
Well, yeah, happy to. And both of these gentlemen are very familiar with this, so I won't bore them with a whole load of details. I'll give you the brief summary. I had become very aware of the challenges facing people, especially people where their homes were under threat, and I started to engage with, of all people, funny enough, Darragh O'Brien, who's now the housing minister. And out of that, he suggested that I use my connections and my networking and all that other stuff to come up with a people's bill. And so we started off on that journey. And that actually brought me to get to know Ed. And he finally agreed that he would draft the bill. That bill was sponsored by John McGuinness when Darragh O'Brien and Micheál Martin turned their backs on it. But we got a substantial bill put together called the Affordable Housing and Fair Mortgage Bill. And to his credit, Matty McGrath and also Senator David Norris equally supported that bill. But that, of course, brought Ed into our lives. He has been, for a long, long time, for most of his career, advocating and pushing for equality of arms in the courts, for access to justice, and now, of course, affordable housing and the right to homes, all that stuff. So the right to homes was really just set up to support and advocate for that legislation.
Thank you, Brian. But what became of the right to homes bill that would have enabled people to stay in their homes? You said that it was introduced into the Dáil by John McGuinness. So I'm sure that Fianna Fáil succeeded in having that legislation enacted in order for people to stay in their homes.
No, they didn't. This is the whole crux of it. I mean, having initiated the idea in conversation with myself, Darragh O'Brien swiftly moved to turning his back on it. Micheál Martin did the greatest sitting on the fence job you've ever seen, even denied knowledge of it. And this was back in 2000, and we started working on that in 2015-16. We eventually came up with the bill in its final form in 2018. As I said, John McGuinness then had to step up and move it as a private member's bill, which Fianna Fáil did not support. In fact, and he denies this, but it's on camera, so it's ridiculous denying it. But we had a huge team of people. As you joined us the other day, Anna, which was terrific, in the gallery in Leinster House to watch the moving of the impaired farm credit bill. But we had a huge group of people who came to the public gallery, watched John McGuinness on his feet, launching the bill. Huge applause, which is not really allowed, but even some TDs joined in. And Sinn Féin, all of the other parties were supporting it, but not Fianna Fáil. And actually, Micheál Martin got up and left his seat as soon as John rose to raise the bill.
And by turning a blind eye, we are allowing the vulture funds to do huge damage to society and families.
Thank you very much.
So please find the time to debate this bill and have it enacted.
Is the bill being opposed? Is the bill being opposed? The bill is not being opposed, so the motion for leave to introduce is agreed. Can I ask Deputy McGuinness to move that the second stage be taken in private members' time?
I saw a move of Count Cora, but is it possible at all for government time? I'd like them to consider it as well.
Is it agreed? It's agreed. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what you're telling me there is that bill eventually got shelved. And do you have any concerns now that the impaired farm credit bill will follow the same route and end up being shelved down the road?
Well, as you are aware, Matty did a very good introduction. We then retired to the AV room in Leinster House, and Ed Honohan gave an impassioned presentation to the gathering there. But it was notable that there was not one single TD from Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, or in fact the Greens.
Or Sinn Féin.
Nobody. Well, Sinn Féin
were.
Yeah, in fairness to Sinn Féin, and I'm not a fan of, or I'm not here to apologise for them, but my understanding is that they were moving something themselves immediately afterwards, but they have expressed their support for this endeavour. So that remains to be seen. But what was more notable was that there was not one single government TD in the AV room, which was very disappointing.
Yeah, I can follow up with that now, because I think that the omens are good, because if you look at the volume of legislation that's come through since the crash in America in 2008, it was very, very long in coming, but it did eventually come. We had Alan Chatter's bill in relation to insolvency. That had to be amended about 3 times. But nevertheless, everything was on hold until that occurred. And now we have a situation where, in relation to sort of the larger insolvencies, we have cases coming through now where banks' vetoes are now being overturned by the court in an appropriate case. And in addition to that, then we had last year, we had Robert Troy's legislation, the SCARP legislation for small companies to provide for administration, a process of administration which didn't involve going to court for most of the serious decisions being made. So if you like to put it this way, the SCARP legislation indicates an understanding on the part of government that there is in fact a problem in relation to short-term difficulties, financial difficulties in companies, in enterprises of that sort. But they didn't extend it to farmers. So just jump on that bandwagon then and say, take the SCARP legislation, modify it and deepen it and improve its quality and extend it to the farming lobby. That's certainly something that seems to me to be unarguable in terms of what's needed there. Just taking Deputy McGrath's point about vulture funds. I know a lot of people say, oh, they're vulture funds and they're not nice, so on and so forth. And they don't like the term being used, and the minister will probably object and say he wouldn't use the word vulture funds. But actually the word itself is, although it's technically not the name of them, it does describe the business model of these funds, which are, if you like, they're the successors to the American hedge fund system, which collapsed the American economy. And now we have it in Europe, and it doesn't really matter what you call them. They're all alternative investment funds. That's to say, they're not going through the banking system. There's capital out there which they're able to borrow at fairly low rates of interest, and they're able to leverage it up. And there's a massive amount of capital flowing around. That's why, as I say, the business fund says global investors are flocking to Dublin, are flocking to Ireland. Now, so alternative investment funds, the difference between them and banks is that they have a short-term turnaround business model. And so if a farmer goes to the alternative investment fund and says, I'd like to borrow money, they'll say, yes, but you'll have to have it back in 3 years. And the farmer will say, well, that's not going to work, is it? And it's for that reason that they're called vultures, because they need their money back fast. They have obligations to their funders in turn, who could be anything, could be sovereign funds, or could be pension funds, or whatever. It could be monies in Cayman Islands and so on and so forth. This is capital that's out there, and it seems to me that it's absolutely essential that alternative investment funds should be involved in lending to farmers. Without that business model being imposed on farmers, and there's absolutely no reason why, in the current climate where we've got new pressures on investors to conform to environmental, social, and governance criteria, that monies would not be made available, would not be organized for agriculture in this country. And part of the bill says, one of the sections of the bill, it's quite a long bill, says that actually the only way we're going to tap into world finance, the European capital market, is for the central bank to act as a broker in relation to accessing, making contacts. They've got a little black book, I'm sure, the central bank, as to who they're dealing with and what funds they're managing in Dublin and so on and so forth. And they've got the little blue book. They have the contacts which the agricultural community need to get access to low-cost finance.
What's been challenged is the ongoing role that Land Registry is playing in all of this. It is misleading the courts in terms of the ownership, the beneficial ownership of the debt related to these properties, whether it's a family home or a farmstead or a farmhouse. You've got this is a huge issue that Edmund Honohan addressed in his role as Master of the High Court in his recent decision. That's one aspect. You've got another one then where you've got receivers being appointed across the country. And in a lot of cases, that's not legitimate and should be challenged. But the courts will not look beyond or behind Land Registry. So there's a massive issue there. And I'd love both Ed and Matty to maybe comment on that, because that is a big, big challenge.
Master, in a recent judgment, you expressed concerns about the land registry process here in Ireland. Can you give us some details on that?
It's quite a technical area, really. It involves a serious question mark over the integrity of the system of the title, as whether it's accurate anymore, because the land registration process, the project, if you like, was established late in the 19th century in order to eliminate a lot of documentation and to make sure that people would be able to find out, I was going to say at the press of a button, who owned land. And the land registry has worked very successfully up until the point in time when securitization took place. So you've got a situation where you could have the ownership of the land registered, and you could have the ownership of a charge registered, that the charge would be the mortgage on the land. And so that they would be registered on the property. And then the securitization process involved, it's very, very technical, it involves a transfer of the asset, which is the security or the collateral, and in return for investment. So the securitization meant that the loan originator would get money from the special purpose vehicle. Sometimes it was an associate company for the bank set up by itself, and that would provide the capital. So the bank would then be no longer out of pocket. but it sometimes would carry on as managing the account for the new owner, which was a foreign entity. And unfortunately then, it appears that there's a lot of confusion about whether or not, when they signed over the collateral to the new owner, whether or not the register had to be changed in order to record that. And in fact, it has happened that many cases have occurred where there's been an application for an order for possession by the loan originator, when it should have been, in fact, by the new owner of the loan, the new owner of the collateral. But that issue is not one that the courts are particularly exercised by. They say, well, it's no concern of the defendant to see whether or not the person who's looking for, the entity who's looking for the possession order is the correct one. That's a matter to be disputed between the loan originator and the investor. You can see how technical this is. And it's technical. And the point about it is that this is a legislative system which was set up by our legislators, which said, let's have a register which will be accurate. And now it's not accurate. And so legislators need to sit up and consider where they go with this. This is a system which has become dysfunctional in regard to the registration of charges. And it's now the case, and I think I observed that recently, that people might buy property from an entity which isn't registered in the land registry. So where we go from this, do we have to demolish the whole thing and start again? Because we're now in a new era of digitization, and the land registration system may well go the way of the dodo, may well go the way of the documents, unless we actually attend to these difficulties and identify clearly who owns what at this point in time. And it's quite important from the point of view of Ireland as a venue for investment, that title to the collateral should be very, very clear. So that's an issue I raised. And I wrote to the governor of the central bank and said that we needed to know more about, the courts need to know more about what exactly is happening in relation to title when it's being securitized. It's a very technical area, and it's not something that I would expect very many people in the country to know about.
Deputy McGrath, you've heard the Master there speak about the need for legislation to be brought forward. Do you see yourself as having a role in this regard?
Yes, we do indeed. And as I said, just a number of ways of introducing legislation. But most basic part of it is we're so lucky, and so Ed's help has been so invaluable, or the Master's help in this because it's pretty watertight and pretty, very, very cleverly drafted. We then have the opportunity of, you asked about the land registry, and it's vital that area is tidied up. But the bills are either moved in our private members' time, or else they go into a lottery system. And for instance, at our business meeting yesterday, we decided, the business committee that run the Dáil's business rather, for next week, not to draw any more for the next month, because there's a stacks of legislation coming forward from government and a lot coming forward with reports. So we won't have a draw for 3 weeks. So I see a role, but what I see a bigger role is maybe formulating these pieces of legislation. The next election isn't far away, whatever way you look at it. I think it's there in the programme for government is where the real sea change need to come. And there has to be a recognition by government that land and any property, whether it be houses, whether it be industrial buildings, a land registry is so important that there's clear identification of who owns what. And we can't have a situation as it is described there that is so fluid at the moment that no one seems to know, and maybe and then it ends up down by the river and that institutions and the law courts. So we need to look. A lot of our legislation is way out of date. We have no land commission either to keep an eye on who's buying up the big conglomerates buying up the land. So there's a lot of work to be done. But certainly we're up for it, but we can't do it on our own, and we need other political parties with us.
If I can come in there, Deputy McGrath, it's quite amusing really to think of this as being an interim arrangement. We in the agricultural community has dealt with banks, high street banks, for donkey's years, and now they find that this is the 21st century, and banks are no longer in the business of being generous with their time and money, and farmers are finding that they need to engage with peer-to-peer lending or credit union or linked assets or some of these other entities which are out there with international capital. And so we have there's a lag, if you like. The legislation hasn't caught up with that. We need to examine, broadly speaking, the whole area of agricultural credit. As I say, that's been a continuing theme during debates right from when the state was set up. And agricultural credit is something which is absolutely vital from the point of view of, say, things like food security, which we never thought we'd worry about in the old days. Food security, why would we worry about that? We haven't got loads of land. Well, yes, of course we've loads of land, but if it disappears into the wrong hands, we could have a problem with food security. Interesting observation, which is that although people might think Brussels is not really on our side here, in fact, the legislation in Brussels is of immense importance. And there is a directive in 2019, which is 1023, which calls for measures to increase the efficiency of procedures concerning restructuring, insolvency, and discharge of debt. Discharge of debt. This is Brussels calling for us to legislate to allow for creditors to be cut down to size. Now that has yet to filter into the government's thinking here, and we haven't seen any kind of realistic policy in relation, our program in relation to this, except for the small businesses, that's to say the companies. So now that process of discharge of debt needs to be extended to the agricultural sector. And that's what Brussels is telling us to do.
Master, if I could put a final question to you. I have been present at a number of evictions, and I suppose the most high profile of those evictions was the brutal eviction of the McGann family, David, Geraldine and Anthony, in Strokestown in December 2018. And in the last couple of years, one of the difficulties that I have observed is that when people get into financial difficulties with the banks and they find themselves before the courts, they don't actually have the finance in order to represent themselves properly in court. And indeed, the whole issue of access to justice has been raised by former President of the High Court, Mr. Frank Clark. He said that you need a very deep pocket going into court. Is there a mechanism within the Impaired Farm Credit Bill that might help farmers access to justice?
No, there isn't. Because that's a completely different area. That will be in the area of the Department of Justice. So I was dealing with it from the point of view of the agricultural sector and the rural TDs. So it's true to say that anybody having to litigate is up against it, particularly if the other side has the deep pockets. But it's also true to say that most farmers who have difficulty with this, they don't actually have a defence. That is the difficulty, and it's very difficult for people to understand how easy it is for a court to just simply sign off on an eviction order, an order for possession. If there's no defence, then the court has a duty to follow the law and to accord to the secured creditor the title deeds of the property. That's where you're at, and that's why defendants find it very frustrating to not to be able to A, understand what's going on, and B, not to be able to have the review of the facts in relation to the case undertaken with particulars, with care and attention. I was just reminded the other day of a case not that long ago, 30 years ago. Judge Costello, who was president of the High Court, and he had to deal with a big share sale argument about shares in Irish distillers. And there was a row between the prospective purchasers and the vendors of the shares. And Judge Costello, at the end of the case, which ran for 3 days, like that, having heard all the evidence, he said there was a contract here because no, it wasn't that because it was written down in pieces of paper or recorded. It was because they had shaken hands. They had shaken hands on it. So that was the contract. Now, there are umpteen cases that I've come across where people say, the bank man told me he would do this, the bank man told me he would do that. And the judge would say, well, there's no evidence of that. But these are cases where, if you like, the old bank honor code was supposed to be in operation. And it was in operation until the American banks collapsed. And then the banks scurried into their holes and said, now we better do things by the book from now on. Whereas the farmers continue to operate on the honor basis. And they're behind the time and they're being caught out at every turn.
On that note, we'll finish. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Honohan, Master of the High Court, for taking time to join us here this morning on the state we're in. Thanks also to Deputy McGrath and to Brian O'Reilly from Right to Homes.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
We am pleased again to be joined, you for organising, Anna, to be joined by the Master and Brian O'Reilly. And then after, Michaela, we have to continue this badly needed work. And thanks for being the host this morning, Anna.
One final comment for you, Anna. You're dealing with the big issue of our day, I think, and that is, with our eyes wide shut, the country has been colonised by vulture funds and cuckoo funds. And call it what you will, like some people call it profiteering, or others might argue that there's unjust enrichment. But in my book, it boils down to gouging. There's a gougery going on here. And these people are here for profit alone, and they're being assisted by our present government, which is shameful. And thank you for the work you're doing. Terrific.
To those of you who have been watching, many thanks. M-Compass Media is a new online news platform. We will never ask you for financial contributions, but you can help by liking and sharing this video. Until we meet again on the state we're in, Bannock Day Arif Galair.